True Crime Declassified is not suitable for children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Declassified, where we go behind the scenes of your favorite true crime content and creators. And after so many technical issues, I am thrilled to be chatting to True Crime, hosted by Celisia Stanton. How are you?
Doing so good. Really excited to be chatting with you today.
Oh, it's so lovely to have you. And you are coming to us from Minnesota, yes?
Yes, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
And I was particularly interested when I was doing some research because I read the tagline on your website that said, "Do you ever listen to a true crime podcast and think that's not quite right?" Which is something I think a lot of people feel from around the world. What is it about true crime that you think makes people feel this way?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's definitely different things for different people. But for me, it really stemmed through like the creation of my show really stemmed through that experience of listening to true crime and feeling like, that doesn't feel quite right. And how that looked in my case was in the winter of 2020, I had recently been the victim of a financial fraud scheme, and was kind of just sort of reeling from just finding out that news and like the FBI investigation and the beginning of like a criminal legal process. And so I was just kind of it was around the holidays, and I was kind of just binging tons of true crime, wanting to just veg out a little bit, do something kind of distract myself. I did lots of like cat puzzles and listened to these podcasts. And since it was 2020, it was pre-vaccine. My fiance Andrew was home all the time. He's a teacher, so really rare situation that for him to be home. And so I would just be like pausing these shows constantly that I was listening to, and just complaining to him about the things that I felt like were ultimately holes in the storytelling.
Yeah.
So that's so many things. But for me, it was like, I just noticed the ways in which there just wasn't a race analysis or gender analysis or, no mention of sexuality and all of these other major things, which majorly impact every aspect of our society. But, and obviously then are going to impact crime and who perpetuates it, or like who commits it and why, and who are the most common victims. But it wasn't being talked about. And I thought that was really odd. It wasn't like a holistic or nuanced telling in that way. I felt like the stories that were being told were primarily about folks who, as traumatic and awful as some of these stories were, weren't the most common victims of these types of crimes, and I felt like the true crime storytellers, and there's definitely some amazing notable exceptions, but I felt like a lot of true crime storytellers didn't necessarily have like a personal connection in that, they just kind of were like, oh, I've always been interested in true crime and now I'm doing this, which isn't inherently like a problem or a bad thing, but I feel like it leaves you open to miss so much because there's just so much lived experience that I feel like gets missed out on, not just as like a crime victim, right? Because all crimes are different, but also just a lot of these hosts were white women who maybe lived in suburban areas or just weren't in situations that were similar to the stories that they were talking about. And so there was just a lot of different things like that I kept noticing. And then it was like after my millionth time of pausing the show, complaining to Andrew, he was like, you know what, you just need to make your own show. And so I was like, okay, it was like one of those moments where I was like, that's actually a great idea. Like, what if I did do that? Which kind of launched me in the adventure of starting true crime. And I didn't know kind of how people would react to that. Did they see the same issues in the genre that I saw? And I found kind of as I put out the show and engaged with folks, like they totally did as well. And for some people, it was like, oh, I always felt like there was something off about some of the true crime content I was consuming, but I didn't know what it was. And for some people, it was like really clear. And this was kind of putting voice to feelings that they'd had for a long time. So it was cool to kind of get to connect with folks who felt similarly.
Definitely. And I think you're so right that though true crime doesn't inherently have to disseminate all of these social issues, when it isn't used to look deeper into these issues, it almost feels like wasted potential because the genre lends itself to that deep analysis so much that it can be so much more than this light entertainment that you do for the gore and the details. You do because it's a way to talk about these issues in society. And like you experienced yourself being a victim, how did that experience of being a victim of financial fraud lead you into podcasting or make you want to then talk about these stories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, it was like one of multiple things. Like it was sort of like 4 separate things that kind of collided at once that led to true crime. And I felt like being the victim of this financial fraud was that final piece. So part one was just my lived experience as like a Black woman, in the United States, and just kind of going about my life and having, family members, obviously, who share similar identities to me. I actually also grew up with gay parents. So that was another thing that I kind of was, dealing with growing up. So I just had a lens already in my life of kind of seeing things from, my perspective in the ways that my identities were maybe marginalized. And so I could have maybe empathy too for the identities that I didn't hold myself, and kind of balance that out with the privileges that I've had in my life. So that was the first thing. Also, I did high school debate, and I coached high school debate for like the past 10 years. And so I've always been a really critical thinker, really outspoken, just kind of inherently wanting to question things, go deeper, know why, and then in the spring and summer of 2020, living in Minneapolis, that's where George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. And so, kind of living through that event and then the subsequent uprising, which started locally and spread globally. And in that time, I really started finding my voice specifically online and in social media, and kind of sharing posts about racial and social justice and all of that, and had some really great conversations that way, and was kind of realizing, people are interested in what I have to say or what I have to share, the perspectives that I hold. So all of those things kind of had happened leading up to the financial crime that I was the victim of. And so then in the fall of 2020, I had started working with this financial advisor, and a few months into working with him, after I had already basically invested my entire life savings, was when I had figured out that he had been defrauding all of his investor clients. And he had stolen over just wild situation. He had stolen over $2 million from all of his clients who had worked with him. And I felt like that experience, because, I was already inclined to think about the criminal legal system in a different way, think about crime in a different way. And that kind of gave me that final piece of now getting to see, okay, what is it actually like to be a victim and have to go through these processes? And have people talking about the story locally and that kind of thing. And for me, I just kept feeling like coming back to this idea of what it meant to be victim-centered, right? Because a lot of podcasts, especially true crime podcasts, especially the ones that I like to listen to, they want to be victim-centered. There's definitely some really out there true crime content, which is really problematic, right? Really sensational, making jokes about really traumatic things. Yeah. And then I think there are a lot of folks who are kind of wanting to do something good. But I still felt like things were missing there because I didn't find myself agreeing with the idea of what victim-centered meant to them, right? Because victim-centered to them would often be, of course, highlighting the victim in this just solely positive way, highlighting the person who had the perpetrator as bad or evil, or just somebody who deserved prison time and all of that. And that might be true in certain circumstances, but it was very black and white. And I felt like through my experience, things were much more nuanced than that. And knowing just the criminal legal system isn't, especially, I'm sure everywhere, but I'm more familiar with in the US, is just there's so many issues with it, and it's super unfair. And so I felt like, there wasn't a lot of room for that nuance either, unless it was the case of someone just if they're wrongfully convicted, maybe there can be some nuance, but otherwise there wasn't a lot of nuance to be talked about. And so for me, victim-centered meant, if we are going to tell this story, how can we utilize this storytelling in a way to prevent these sorts of things from happening again in the future? Yeah. I felt like a lot of the takeaways that, true crime creators were trying to leave folks with was this idea that you should fear anyone, that anyone could be a potential perpetrator, that you could be victimized at any moment, even your own family and friends, you always had to keep an eye out for. And that I felt like was a really not great, not healing message. I, obviously feel like storytelling can be used for so many positive things. And one of those things is bringing a community together. And I felt like that message was the opposite of that. It's the sort of logic that I feel like leads to situations where like white women call the police on Black men, right? Because if you're fearing anyone and you just should be comfortable with calling law enforcement at any point, that's the sort of circumstance that you end up in. And so I kind of felt like, how can we change the takeaway from these stories to kind of bring people together or to build a sense of empathy and connection versus to divide and make people fearful of one another?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're at a real turning point in true crime. If you don't know, whoever listening, I'm a PhD researcher looking into the ethics of true crime. And a lot of my research is discussing or talking about true crime in a way that's very critical, talking about how true crime is exploitative and isn't being used for good. And then I see creators like yourself who is doing completely the opposite of that. So I think we are seeing a turning point. But there has been so much true crime content created that there is a lot of damage to try and undo. So if someone was listening to this and thinking, I want to use my voice for something good, what's your one piece of advice that you'd give in terms of creating a true crime podcast that really centers the victim?
Well, I mean, I think if you were a consumer, like if you're not planning to create a true crime podcast, but you just consume it, you're like a fan of that type of content or media, I think the biggest thing is to be critical, right? To be critical of what you're listening and to ask questions and to, look into things yourself. If you're creating a true crime podcast, one of the biggest things is to like interrogate the reasons why you want to be involved in that community of true crime, but more specifically true crime like content creation. Just because I feel like there's a lot of great work to be done, and like you said, there's so many awesome folks who are doing really cool things in the space, and I think there's been a big conversation that started over the last few years. But at the same time, I think it's one of those situations where there's a lot of people doing great work, and how could you maybe add to that work versus like take up space if that's not something that like is 100% necessarily what you need to do. I feel like I've heard some of this advice more generally when folks talk about like, oh, I'm interested in starting this nonprofit. It's like, okay, are there people already doing work in those spaces? And how can you join that effort that's already been doing so you can kind of build a coalition and kind of combine your strengths and kind of help those folks who've been doing it for a long time? Obviously, there's space for everyone. So like, I feel like if it is a situation where you have something that you feel like is unique to offer, like that's an amazing thing. And that was one of the things that I was kind of thinking about as I was starting the show. Was the very first episode I wrote was about Darlie Roudier, which is a story that has been covered a ton in true crime media. And so part of the reason I started with that episode was I really wanted to see, could I take this story that's been told a million times and tell it in a new way, in a fresh way? Because if that was the case, then maybe this was a project, worth pursuing.
And so why did you then choose, you're in the position where you are a fan of true crime, you listen to it, but something doesn't sit right with you. You've experienced this financial fraud. Why did you use true crime podcasting as the medium to then tell your story as opposed to other avenues for kind of social change? Why is true crime so good in that respect?
Well, for me, part of it was just my personal interest in it. I was like, clearly I'm listening to so much of this, and that this is just what's resonating with me at this moment in time. And also though, it's like true crime is so popular, and if anything, it's just grown in popularity, right? It just, the amount of content that we have out in the world in general is just insane, especially, just like with increasing, like everyone's on TikTok, everyone's on Instagram, like, there's just so much content all the time. But I think in true crime, especially, that's true. I just feel like every day there's like 20 new documentaries and new podcasts and all of that. And so I felt like that was a great medium to use because it had such wide appeal. And therefore I could potentially reach so many people. and for me, the big thing is I never wanted to be like the social justice podcast or the political podcast. I wanted to be a true crime podcast, you know, that like inherently, if I was going to be talking about true crime, we were going to be talking about social issues. We're going to be talking about political issues because those things cannot be separated. But I wanted to be within a genre that so many people connected with, because then I could kind of meet people where they already were.
I think it's used as a vehicle to discuss these issues rather than laying everything out on the table. And conversations around social issues can be really difficult. And I think packaging it within true crime and making sure that everything you're doing within that is ethical and, you know, you're putting your best foot forward with it. I think it does make it easier for people to discuss these issues in a way that is going to be informative but also engaging and entertaining. And that was why I was really excited when I came across your podcast, because it does link so heavily to my research on the ethics of true crime. I'd love to know, kind of in your own words, why you believe there needs to be a change in how we tell true crime stories, and going forward, what sort of idealized future do you see for the true crime genre?
I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, these stories are like, they're really difficult topics. And I think that they're talking about some of the most difficult, most traumatic things, the worst parts of people's lives oftentimes. And so that deserves, you know, a level of dignity and respect. And I feel like that's just the right thing to do. And so I feel like insofar as, you know, there are many ways in which the genre has failed these families and victims, you know, there needs to be something to kind of correct for that. For me, you know, I feel like, you know, it really depends. You'll talk to different true crime creators, you'll talk to different family members, different victims, all of that. And everyone kind of has a different boundaries for things that they're comfortable with and what ethical true crime looks like and all of those things. So, I mean, I don't have like this very super clear idealized version, but I think it's one, I think the true crime, and a more ideal true crime landscape would be one where people think more deeply, that they have greater empathy for people, that they that they can hear these stories and think, oh, maybe I could actually take some action in my own life to, you know, better the world or to better my community. I think one of the things that, you know, I try to do on each episode of True Crime is to have those action steps to kind of push people to take some real steps related to the story they just heard, whether it be like directly supporting the people most directly impacted by a story, like monetarily or whatever else, or whether it be, you know, helping in ways that are kind of like closely related, right? So maybe if I tell a story which has themes, you know, certain themes, then maybe there's an organization that's working on that exact issue that people can get involved with, that kind of thing. And then also, I just feel like it spurs conversation, and that would be a great thing for like the future of true crime, for us to just be talking more about these issues in a way that is nuanced, because I think that right now, you know, it's really easy to mindlessly consume true crime, not think about it at all. And if you're mindlessly consuming something, there's no reason for you to go back to your friend group or to the family dinner table and have a conversation. And so that was one of the cool things I've loved about true crime, is when people reach out to me and they're like, oh, I'm listening to this with my dad or, you know, my coworkers, and we have to unpack the issue, like the episodes when they're done, you know? So I feel like, you know, a world where people are thinking, they don't have to come to the same conclusion that I'm coming to in every episode, but that they're critically engaging with it. That would be, you know, a great situation for the true crime genre.
And I noticed as I was doing my research that you mentioned a GoFundMe for a family who also experienced financial fraud. And I think that's really representative of where true crime can go and where true crime can be so good. And when I kind of looked into that GoFundMe page, I saw that a lot of the people commenting were referencing terrible thanks for asking as the reason why they were donating, which isn't necessarily true crime, but does talk about sort of the hardships that people face. What has been the response to your podcast? Do you find that it has been more of a rally for people to then go on and make positive changes for themselves and for the people around them?
Yeah, I mean, I like to hope that that's the case. I think, I mean, I've gotten some great messages from people who, like I said, have had conversations with, you know, family, friends, loved ones. And then, you know, there was one, like, it's really great when I have folks reach out who are related to these stories and they are like connect with me and feel that this story had a positive impact on them, or that they felt like their family member story was told in a good way. Like recently, when I wrote the episode on Darlie Roudier, since it was my first episode, I hadn't even reached out to any of the family members or to Darlie herself, you know, and if I were to do that episode now, that's something I feel like I have more experience with, I could do, but I didn't do that at the time. I just tried to tell it the best that I could. And I recently had Darlie's aunt reach out and just say that she had happened across it, listened to it, and really appreciated the telling of it.
Oh, wow.
Or, you know, just in terms of like other folks and how they've kind of contributed. I had, you know, one episode on Jonestown, and one of the surviving victims of Jonestown, we were able to direct to, you know, his Cash App so that folks could support him in some of the goals that he has and writing a book about his experiences and all of that. And after the episode came out, he reached out to let me know that a lot of listeners had donated to him, that it really kind of renewed a lot of his excitement about, you know, telling his story. And Jonestown specifically, it's a hard one because there's few survivors that were there that day. And, you know, they're very wary of the media because they've been really exploited since the tragedy occurred. So things like that, I feel like it was great. You know, that's something that, you know, listeners did just by feeling empowered by what they heard and then going and actually making like a real tangible impact on someone's life. So that I think is a really great thing that's been really exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, and that's so positive to hear. I mean, you just think Jonestown is such a massive true crime story. And if every person who told the story of Jonestown was to then direct listeners to a GoFundMe or to the survivors, if they are telling their stories firsthand through a novel, just imagining the positive impact that would have, I think is just fantastic. I saw on your website that you invite people to recommend a podcast episode. Why is it important to bridge the gap between true crime podcaster and listener?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we're always just looking for more stories, right? I think that sometimes the stories that are least likely to be told are ones that are maybe less like popular, less covered by other podcast media outlets and things like that. So really asking for recommendations and things like that, stories to check out, was an opportunity, or like a try at telling stories that aren't going to get told otherwise. I think the stories that I picked for season 1, I found in such random and different ways. Some of them I was already familiar with, some was done like a research rabbit hole or some Reddit thread. And then, you know, as I've been working on season 2, you know, we've definitely pulled some amazing stories from folks who've reached out as well. Just with stories that maybe were local to their community, or perhaps like they had a connection to them. So I think that, you know, that's the really interesting thing too, is like, no matter what community you're from, there are these stories that exist in your community. And so often though, attention is directed towards very specific people, right, that catch the nation's attention. And then you kind of get lost in, well, what's happening in my community that I maybe could get involved with? So that's kind of why we've been asking for suggestions. It's just a way to kind of like expand the net of the types of stories that we can tell.
When you have someone reach out to you and say, I have this story, whether it affected them personally or someone they knew or someone in their community, do you feel that you have a responsibility of care then to them to kind of support them through the process? How involved are they then in the process of making the podcast?
Well, so far, the folks who've reached out about stories that we've taken on haven't necessarily been like directly related. I haven't worked on the episodes where they directly related. There are a few that I'm like in the very beginning stages of working through, and you know, and in general, the episodes I've done where I've reached out to people who were directly affected, Jonestown, or like an episode I did on Celisia Stanton. There's multiple episodes for the next season. That's super important. I mean, like the people who were directly involved, you know, this is a really sensitive thing for them. And also, you know, it's putting a lot of trust in me and the folks that are working on the show that we're going to tell that story with care, with dignity. I myself, you mentioned Terrible Thanks for Asking, which is a great podcast. And I love that show. And they covered my story and the story of the Gonzaleses, which is the the family that we had started the GoFundMe for. So we were both defrauded in the same financial fraud scheme. And that, was an opportunity for me to kind of be on the other side of things, right? To kind of entrust somebody in telling my story for me, or, with me, but also for me, And so I kind of I had experienced sort of the emotional, like, a roller coaster of that. And so I felt like that helps me kind of have empathy for what it might be like for folks who are sharing their story or are comfortable to talk with me and like allow me to tell the story on true crime. So I also just feel like in general, it's been a really good connection point that, I've been able to kind of say, maybe I haven't had the same experience that you had, but I've had this experience and I've experienced some of the criminal legal system. And it's a good way for people to feel a little bit more comfortable that they're in good or safe hands. But that's something that I think we're still navigating, and it will continue to as we create more episodes and see like what is the best process, because I think it's a tricky thing. People are nuanced and emotions are, heavy, and like everyone is going to react differently to that process. So it's definitely something we're still exploring.
And what was that experience like of working with Terrible Thanks for Asking and giving your trust to them to tell your story? It must have been really daunting.
Yeah, I think at first it's like, and I had started talking to them about the story like literally the day after it happened, because I was set to talk to them just in general to see if there was some story from my life that maybe would be able to be told on the show. And then it just so happened that call was scheduled for the day after I found out that financial fraud had occurred.
Oh, wow.
And so yeah, it was just kind of like serendipitous in that way. But, so, when I hadn't fully thought through much of anything about it at that point, I was just like, yeah, sure. I mean, I didn't necessarily have a huge interest in telling my own story in like a podcast form or anything like that. But I think, it's one of those things that I learned. It was a great process, and their team is incredible. And I love Nora. She's, such a great storyteller and great writer. That's the host of the show. But I also just kind of learned throughout that process. It's like, okay, at the end of the day, it's like you tell your story the way that you're going to tell your story. And so like, that's never going to 100% overlap with the way that anyone else is going to tell it. And so it was really cool though, because it was an opportunity where I got to connect with the Gonzaleses, the other family that was a victim of the financial fraud as well. And I wouldn't have been able to really, I would have been able to, but I probably wouldn't have connected with them had the podcast not come to be, because they came, Nora and, one of their other team members came to the sentencing hearing for the perpetrator of the financial fraud. And, the Gonzaleses Reverend Gonzalez, gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing, a really great, powerful impact statement. And so then TTFA connected with them after that point, him and his wife. And so they were able to kind of connect me with them. And that was like a relationship I'm really grateful for. They're a great family. And it was just cool to kind of talk through some of this stuff with somebody who had been through the same thing. And, their experience of it was totally different than mine, because they're at a completely different place in their life, it was a different amount of money. So it was definitely, really interesting in that regard too, to kind of get to hear their story get told as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting when I hear American true crime podcasters actually going to the courtroom and seeing the process, because in the UK, like, it's so much more closed off. I was having a conversation on the last episode with Crimes Through Time about how in the UK, unless the crime has been solved, you can't access any of the information, whether it's 60 years old or, 5 years old. You can't access any of the information unless it's been solved. And you can't, as far as I'm aware, just go and access the courtroom and all that sort of thing. But I think in terms of connecting true crime creators, good true crime creators, don't get me wrong, we don't want the courtrooms filled with people looking for the next story, but connecting really good-hearted true crime creators with people who they can tell the story. I think that's a really powerful avenue then. So you mentioned Nora as the host of Terrible Thanks for Asking, and she's, really setting the standard in terms of hosting. What qualities do you think are needed for a true crime presenter or true crime podcaster to be a positive force for the community?
I mean, for me, like, first and foremost is probably empathy. I feel like that's one of the biggest things that I feel like sometimes is missing is the sense that everything is so black and white. It's like you're good or you're bad. And in true crime, that feels really clear cut because like you're the victim or you're the perpetrator. And it's just not that clear cut. There's just so much more that goes into these things and so many, more pieces to the story that really get left out. And, one of the things I like to try to explore on true crime too is like, well, why do people commit, some of these acts? I believe it's Miriam Cabo, who's this prison abolitionist I really admire. She has a quote. I'm not sure if she was quoting someone else, but it's just that nobody enters violence for the first time having committed it. And this idea that like, everything comes from something. And I think if our goal is to prevent these things from happening again in the future, we need to go deeper than just bad guy, put them in prison and say like, why did this happen? And I feel like the answers to that are really complex. And so that's why empathy is really important, because it really allows you to sort of see these issues in all the shades of gray that they are. And then, just otherwise, I feel like, and there's a lot of folks who do this, but just like really good storytelling, I feel like that's how you draw somebody in. That's how you connect them to the people in the story. That's how you make them care, So I think that was like a really important thing for me, was just like, how can I be a good storyteller, keep people sort of hooked throughout? And really that's balancing that entertainment alongside, sensationalizing. You obviously don't want to sensationalize, but it is a form of entertainment, and that's part of the reason it works and can really empower people to action. I feel like, when I think about the global uprising that happened after the murder of George Floyd, many, many people had been killed at the hands of police before George Floyd had been killed. But it was, this single story that people could so clearly see and understand that really catalyzed all the action that came after, sort of course, in the name of all the people who came before. And so I feel like I see true crime in a similar way, where it's like each episode, you have this opportunity to tell a single story, and that single story can be really mobilizing to people. So I feel like doing a good job keeping people engaged is really important too.
That's such a fantastic point to make. And you're so right that the murder of George Floyd was almost served as a catalyst to then, be a call to arms for the entire world. I mean, I know in the UK, we had protests up and down the country, and it did so much good in that sense. And that's nothing to take away from the hardships faced by the people before George Floyd. But I think it's really interesting to look at why that was a catalyst for people to then come out and actually, realize that these things happen, and to kind of come from their little cave of privilege and understand kind of what's going on in that sense. And I think it's so valuable to see true crime as being able to be that catalyst for people, and for these stories. I see so much criticism around true crime, and don't get me wrong, some of it is warranted, but I think people try and view it through a very small lens of it's all exploitative and you can't be entertained by this. And I think you can be entertained by it in the same way you can be entertained by horror films, because you are looking at really the worst that someone could feel. And afterwards, if that then motivates you to donate or to talk or to share and reach out to people, I think that can only then be a good thing. I wanted to pick up on what you said about how we perceive and how we present the quote unquote bad guys in the story, because this is something that I've been grappling with as a researcher and going into it. On the one hand, I think that you're completely right that everyone has a backstory, and that, no person goes out and commits crime for the sole reason of committing crime. And then on the other hand, you don't want to go into these stories and almost find excuses, I guess, for the reason why people do things, which then can be detrimental to the victim. Do you find that it's difficult to toe that line between I want to explore why people do things, but I also don't want to excuse their actions?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tricky line to toe. And I'm sure that for some folks, like the way I tell stories might be, too far in one direction or another. Really, all I can do is what I feel like is most true to myself. I feel like I trust my intuition is what I kind of try to do in terms of like phrasing and how you word things and where you place emphasis and all of that. And so I'm always very, very careful as I'm writing things and thinking about things, or everything I put out there is very much thought through. And not just because I wanted to, in large part because I wanted to that line. I want to put out things that are that I believe in and that I can stand by. And also just, also as a Black woman putting things out into the world, I'm already subject to criticism just for doing anything, just for putting thoughts out into the world. And that was something I really experienced after the murder of George Floyd, when I was posting a lot on social media about racial justice, the amount of vitriol that people have just for talking, any mention of race or anything like that really can trigger people. So I'm very thoughtful about how I go about talking about things, wording things, thinking about things. And then at the same time, I hold space for the fact that I'm not always going to get it right, So, there might be a day in the future where someone feels like I gave too much empathy to a perpetrator or something of that nature. And I think that all I can do at that point is just stand by at the time I said something, what I said, and then correct and be open to feedback when necessary. And I think that's the thing, is just being open to feedback, because a lot of people, especially in media, it's just such a hypercritical time, right? It's just people can just anonymously say anything to you on the internet and TikTok comments and DMs on Instagram, everywhere. And so, they're pretty emboldened to give you feedback and critique on everything. And so I think there's an inclination sometimes amongst creators to just be well, whatever, I'm just not going to respond to any of it. But I think then you lose an opportunity to kind of grow and to put out better content and to become a more empathetic and better storyteller. So I think at the end of the day, I just try to kind of stay aware of the conversations people are having about true crime and take that into the things that I'm creating and putting out in the world. Right now, there's a lot of conversation around the new Netflix documentary about Dahmer, and also the sort of dramatized, fictionalized version that movie that's coming out about Gabby Petito. And there's a lot of conversations happening about that. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to read about and learn about, hear people's perspectives on, because I think that it kind of deals with a lot of the issues that you were just asking about. So I can try to bring that into the way that I'm talking about really sensitive things. I think it is difficult, people, I totally feel for me, before I was the victim of the financial crime, I just sort of saw myself as, I had very radical politics. I considered myself a prison industrial complex abolitionist. I didn't, and that's not to say okay, tomorrow you just get rid of the police and prisons and all of that stuff. That's not really where the basis of the beliefs came from. It was more just these systems aren't working. They need to be so radically redesigned as to not exist at all in the form that they exist in currently. They'd be so different. And so when I was the victim of the financial crime, I kind of like to think about it as the greatest challenge to my ideology thus far, right? Because now I'm in this position where I'm supposed to be protected by the criminal legal system, where I have this perpetrator who everybody in my life felt extremely negative about. And that was just a lot to grapple with and think about. And it was really had to be what do I genuinely believe about people who perpetuate crimes or do bad things? And it's still complicated. I don't have this perfect answer, but I try to bring that sort of nuance back and forth that I had myself to the storytelling.
Yeah. And I think that's what true crime can do, because it doesn't have an agenda. It's not pro-police. It's not necessarily anti-police, though there are a lot of kind of anti-police rhetoric in true crime. But I think the source of that anti-police rhetoric is because people are talking about these stories where people are very much let down, and these victims are let down by policing and by the criminal justice system. I think that's what makes true crime so powerful. That it's not biased. It doesn't have an agenda. And I think also, as we mentioned earlier, that the representation in true crime of Black LGBTQ plus minority victims hasn't been the standard that it should have been. And I think it is changing, like with creators like yourself. And I read a study that was looking at, I forgot what the podcast is. I think it was My Favorite Murder or something along those lines. And if you were to compare the earlier podcast episodes to the ones currently, there's a huge shift. And I think that is positive, but I think we need to continue that energy because a lot of the Black victims are, as you know, coming from America and being a Black woman, they are underrepresented by the media. And I think that true crime can bridge that gap between traditional media that falls short and pick up that slack and say, actually, we're going to talk about these people because they deserve to be spoken about. And similar on that sense, especially in your first season, when you were kind of looking for stories to tell, how did you navigate consent and identifying which stories were then appropriate for you to discuss?
Well, and I wanted to comment on something you said too, just about like the true crime being biased or unbiased or being, kind of pro or anti-police. And one of the things I felt when I was consuming true crime content was that it was so weird. It's like true crime over and over and over again will tell you, here are all the ways in which police have like botched their job.
Yeah.
And, our criminal legal system didn't do what it was supposed to do. And yet there's a good chunk of true crime, like loyalists or, like people who listen to a lot of true crime or watch a lot of true crime who believe the opposite. And in that way, true crime can oftentimes act as a vehicle, I feel like, of cop propaganda, of like, this idea that our justice system just functions like despite all the evidence to the contrary. And that's what's really weird to me, because it's like, if you hear something over and over and over and over again, which is that, okay, like these people were let down by the law enforcement, these people were let down by law enforcement, these people were let down by law enforcement. And then those same podcasters are collaborating with law enforcement or defending law enforcement in then in other episodes. I mean, that's a conflicting message, and I think a lot of true crime creators are scared to go on the record with any particularly strong take. They want to toe this line down the middle. But if you're for everyone, I don't really think you're for anyone, right? Like, I think that it's not, people want figures that are polarizing. They want to connect with a storyteller because they feel like they share values with them and all of that. I mean, I think some of the most popular podcasts are hosted by incredibly polarizing people, like, outside of the true crime space. I think of like Joe Rogan's podcast, is incredibly popular. And he has some very particular beliefs, obviously, so I think that's an interesting thing, but totally separate from the question you asked.
I'll follow on from that, actually, because it's interesting you say that, because from a lot of my research, I came across people saying that true crime was pro-police and was kind of shoving this the police are fantastic ideology. And my immediate response to that was, where? I've not heard that in the true crime content that I consume, but I think that really harks back to the incredible scale that the genre is, and you can very much, and I'm fully guilty of it, of staying within my bubble of true crime content that I connect with and that I engage with and I'm happy with. And you can kind of, and I certainly have having to hold myself accountable as a researcher, that the entire community is not on that same level and doesn't hold themselves to that same standard as the content that I personally consume. So I think it's a really good point to bring up that true crime is not a monolith, in that it is so diverse for good and for bad, but the people who are very pro-police, and I appreciate that you brought up collaborating with the police, because that's another aspect of it that I think needs to be spoken about more, is that relationship between the police and true crime podcasters. But I think you can very much get within your own bubble of true crime and see that as a mirror that just reflects in the community as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, an example, like an interesting example of this is like, the show Crime Junkie is super popular true crime podcast. And I've looked at, because I think similar to My Favorite Murder, and this is just anecdotal, I'm not sure if this is true, but they seem to be maybe covering more cases of marginalized folks in recent years or months or whatever. Than maybe previously. Obviously, I don't know. I didn't do any kind of like analysis on this, but that's just my as a listener, that's what I felt. And I've looked at some of the reviews, because I'm always just curious, what are people saying? What's the reactions people are having? And the amount of reviews that they get from people saying, you know, they hate the police now, like the creators of the show, they hate the police now, or this is just a bunch of like liberal propaganda now, like all of this stuff, which to me is really interesting, because I don't think that they're that overt on that show at all. Yeah. Like, I mean, beyond just, you know, they're covering some of these cases, they're hitting at some of the issues, you know, no hate to them. I'm just saying, like, you could go far more overt than they're going. And they're getting that reaction from a lot of people who clearly are in the true crime community, who consume true crime content, who they don't want any mention of, even a mention of race, or talking about how historically, you know, they'll make a mention in an episode about, like, you know, there's a history with police in Black neighborhoods, and that is enough for folks to feel like really upset. And feel like, you know, this is not true crime content they want to consume anymore. I went to CrimeCon, like the crime convention, I guess you could say, like true crime convention in Las Vegas this past spring. And that was another instance that was really interesting. I think that, definitely not everybody, but a lot of the folks that drew were that more traditional true crime camp of, you know, just super pro police, pro the justice system, feels like it all operates how it should, like that black and white thinking. And, you know, so it's just really interesting, because I think, like you were saying, it's a huge spectrum. There's lots of different people. And because it has such mass appeal, I mean, it's like you talk to almost any like female identified person between the ages of like 18 and 35, and they probably consume some type of true crime content. That's going to have a lot of diversity in it, you know, a lot of different people who feel different things. So
I remember actually a true crime documentary that I watched on Netflix about the Yorkshire Ripper. I don't know how much you know about the Yorkshire Ripper, a UK case where it was a male serial killer up north. And tangent, but my dad, when he was in his 20s, because my family are kind of from that region, my dad was pulled over by the police because they were searching for the Yorkshire Ripper, and they were pulling over every single male who was around that age, because they were just so desperate to find him. And my dad is obviously not Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. But when I was watching the documentary about it, what really struck me was how much they were talking about the gender violence, because his victims were all women who were, you know, out late at night. And the response at the time was to tell women not to leave the house, which obviously resulted in protests from women saying, you know, this isn't our problem. And what I was really happy about was that the documentary mentioned that and spoke about that, because I think it's so important to talk about the society at the time, but also how socially the case impacted the wider community, because victims are very rarely chosen at random. They're chosen because they are female, black, gay, and you see these themes pop up constantly. And if you're not going to be discussing the reasoning behind those victims being chosen, then you're not going to do them justice.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I did an episode on Samuel Little, who's a sort of infamous Black serial killer who targeted these like vulnerable, you know, Black women, trans women, you know, just some of the most marginalized people in society. And he was very intentional in doing that. And then it's like, once you look into the data on serial killers, it's like, if you are a sex worker, you are like 50, I think it was like 48% in this one study, 48% of all serial killer victims were sex workers. Like that's wild, you know, like and yet, you know, those themes aren't talked about in a deep way oftentimes in true crime media. So
yeah, definitely. And I think it's one of the ways that true crime can really be used as a positive force, is if we talk about those things. As you're creating your true crime podcast, especially in the first season when you were finding stories to talk about, how did you navigate consent in terms of the victim stories? And what would you say to true crime podcasters who are also trying to navigate consent?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. I think it goes back to a question of like, who does the story belong to? And that's something I thought about a lot as I've worked on the show. You know, one of the things that made me think about that was there was a boy in the US who was, you know, murdered by police named Tamir Rice. And his mom has done some amazing activism work, and she had talked about how she had felt like people had utilized her son's story, like these different activists and things had utilized her son's story sort of without her consent for their own benefit and own platforming. And, where was the help and support back to her and her family and her community? And I thought about that a lot, just specifically with what she's talked about. And I think it's one of those things where, like I said, the question becomes, who does a story belong to? And I think you can obviously have, if you can reach out to people and try to work with them, that's excellent. Obviously, that's the best case scenario. But then at the same time, it's like stories, then they do become so much more than the individual circumstance which they played out. Like you could take George Floyd, which we were talking about earlier. This is one story, and his story does belong, to his family and friends. And yet it's this global story now, right? It's this story that's been, kind of taken up to represent so many other people before him and after him. And so I think it's tricky because it's like, at the end of the day, these stories need to be out there, and we don't necessarily always get to choose which ones are the ones that are platformed by, society that people connect with. So I don't know. It really depends on each episode, how I'm navigating it. When I can reach out to people or find contact information and stuff, I do. And that's always been great. And so far, people have been really eager to kind of like have their story be told or collaborate, or at least give, information about how they can be supported or how we can direct support. I think, it really depends on where those people, like the people involved, are at. How recently did the story take place? Like what was their connection to the story that's being told? For example, the episode I did on Celisia Stanton, who was a young man who was convicted on faulty DNA evidence. He was convicted as a minor, and his mom was such a huge part of, him eventually getting freed from prison, just advocating on his behalf. She never gave up on him. And so I just was able to find her and reach out to her. And so she was an amazing person to talk to, and she really wanted her story to be out there and her son's story to be out there, because she wants people to know, like, this is what, the Houston Police Department and their crime lab was doing. And here's how this happens all the time. With like Jonestown, for example, those survivors were less willing and open to going, being interviewed, going on the record officially. And because they're a lot more wary of media, like I was saying previously. And so I kind of navigated that differently by, instead of being like, okay, I'm going to directly involve them in an interview, or, like put them out there without their them specifically out there without their consent. I'm going to see how I can direct support in ways that they want. So I had like one person who wanted to be completely anonymous, but had an organization that he wanted folks to direct support to, because he felt like it aligned with, how he felt about, the events that happened and the organization and the church that he was part of. And so it really is super individual. And I feel like it's another one of those things that's kind of nuanced. And I think you just kind of tread as best you can.
When you do talk about these topics that may potentially bring up some feelings in people that are negative, how do you navigate your content in a way that is informational and engaging without then triggering people and triggering a response in people? Or do you think that that's not necessarily a responsibility of true crime content creators?
I mean, I think, I try to, I'm not necessarily responsible for someone's individual specific emotional response, but at the same time, I feel like I can do what I can to be responsible, and like a responsible creator and a responsible storyteller, and do just like the right thing, or what I would want from people in media and people who are telling stories. I feel like, I definitely put content warnings at the top of every episode. Which I've had a few people reach out about that, they heard a content warning and then they didn't listen to an episode. So that was like helpful for them.
Oh, really?
They weren't in the right headspace for that. Yeah. So like, for some people that's a good way to do it. And then there's sometimes where we talk, like I try to avoid any really graphic descriptions. Like I just feel like that's unnecessary. More than often than not is really unnecessary. You can usually still tell a story without going into graphic detail of exactly what happened. with the Darlie Rudier episode, there's a 911 call that's really infamous that Darlie makes from her home. And I had heard it on different true crime media I'd consumed previously. And, you know, they kind of like, people like have a tendency to, if they're going to play a 911 call, to sort of unpack it and speculate about it and that kind of thing. And that didn't feel quite right to me, because I was like, I have no expertise to be able to like analyze somebody's emotional reaction. And I also just don't really believe in that. I feel like everyone's going to react differently. No one knows how someone's going to react in a circumstance like that. But on the other hand, the call was really important to the story, in that, you know, it was very much used against Darlie in the trial and just how the public perceived her. And so I kind of had gone back and forth, like, do I include this audio? Do I not? And so I just kind of did an explanation before we played the audio that really kind of gave people a warning of what they could expect, what was going to happen, like kind of let them into my thought process a little bit about why I was sharing it. And I felt like, you know, her family and advocates had shared it previously because they wanted people to like know about this and advocate for her. She's still on death row. So that's kind of how I came to that decision. But I feel like if you are sharing something really like sensitive like that, like a 911 call or graphic details about like really these awful traumatic events, if your listener is not having an emotional response to that, then you're probably not doing good job storytelling it. Yeah. You know, definitely. Like, I feel like it's actually, there was a TikTok sort of like joke going around that like, is like, oh, me when I'm listening to true crime, and it's like this audio that's like, her arms were cut off, her legs were cut off, blah, 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 blah. And like the person just like eating popcorn or whatever. And it's like, that is to me a critique of the creators of true crime. If people can really just like be completely desensitized and have no emotional reaction to these terrible, terrible things. Like, where is the empathy, right? You create empathy through good storytelling, through drawing empathetic portraits of the people that you're talking about. So, you know, I feel like there are a lot of people who listen to episodes and be like, oh my gosh, I like cried at this part or whatever. And to me, that's an indication that I'm doing a good job. So an emotional reaction, I don't think is always a negative thing, but obviously people need to take care of themselves when choosing what they're going to listen to.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic point. And I'm so fed up in true crime of hearing hosts describe a victim by their looks and saying, you know, she was so beautiful and her smile could light up a room, I think is such a stereotype of describing victims in true crime. I want to hear about what they did for work. I want to hear about what their aspirations were for the future, what they were like in social settings. So I think that's where we really sort of tap into the human side of true crime victims. And interesting you brought up about the 911 or 999 calls, because that's again something for me that has been a real pet peeve in true crime, is where they play this 999 call and then these 2 or 3 whoever's hosting the podcast, completely unqualified people, sit there and try and psychoanalyze it. And I don't know how many you have met or how many the listeners have met. British people don't give a lot of emotion to things. And so as someone sitting there culturally because obviously a lot of these calls are 911 calls, someone who's British listening to that and thinking, I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to respond to something is to not say a lot, because the human brain and the human body responds to trauma in ways that no one can really define. And I think that's where true crime gets dangerous, is where we start to try and find our own conclusions to things.
Right, exactly. We're like projecting our own, how we feel we might react on other people, which is really dangerous when we live in a world with a lot of biases and we have a lot of preconceived notions about women, about, you know, Black folks, about you know, LGBTQ folks. Like, that's going to play into how we're perceiving someone. And in Darlie's case, her gender totally played into how people saw her, as opposed to how they saw like even her husband. So I think it's really important that, again, this is like back to the empathy piece. It's like, I feel like the listener, you know, has partial responsibility, but it really comes down to who's hosting, who's writing, who's telling the story as well.
Something that I've spoken about with my supervisors at university. So I had a probation review for my PhD, and the person I was talking to mentioned about the role of the self in podcasting and the host's role of the self. How much do you insert yourself into the story, or do you view yourself as more of a narrator?
It's like, I don't view myself solely as a narrator, because I don't think it's possible to, I think to pretend to be like completely objective is just like kind of disingenuous. Like, everybody is going to bring something to these stories. And I also don't want to tread too far and like over inserting myself where it becomes about me and not about the people whose story I'm telling. So, you know, like all things, it's a balance, right? So a lot of times I will have intros that connect the story or the theme that I'm going to discuss with personal events in my own life. Sometimes not, but sometimes I do that, or I'll kind of like explain how I'm thinking about something, or questions that I have that led me down a certain research hole, like all of that. So I try to kind of bring the listener along with me as I was like thinking about and learning about the story. And I just feel like, I don't know, like, I don't ever want to pretend that I'm just like this objective, like omniscient voice, right? Like I definitely have my perspective, and that's what I actually think is of value that I'm trying to bring to the work that I'm doing. And so I see it as like a mixture of those things, like how are my lived experiences informing the ways that I'm perceiving the story? And then also, how can I make sure that I'm focusing on the people involved to like the best of my abilities.
I could keep talking to you for hours, but I will not keep you for your entire day. I'll do a couple of quickfire questions before we wrap things up. So, how would you define your podcast in 3 words?
Oh, that's really hard. I would say nuance for sure. I would just say good storytelling, nuance and good storytelling.
Fantastic. And to anyone looking for a new true crime obsession, what can they expect from True Crime?
I think you could just expect empathetic tellings of all types of stories you've heard before in a new way, stories that you've definitely never heard of, but explore themes that may have impacted your life or the lives of your community members, and stories about things that are maybe typically considered historical or political, like less traditional true crime, but I kind of try to tell them through a true crime perspective. So all different types of stories. It's definitely it's storytelling based. And by that, I mean, like, it's not just a listing of facts. I really try to bring you through it in a way that feels like, you know, obviously it's a podcast, but if you were watching a movie or something like that, you know, there's going to be an arc to kind of keep you hooked and interested. And there's always going to be key takeaways. So if you're looking for something that you can bring into your real life, true crime might be a great fit for you.
And to round things off, what are your social media handles so people know where to find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at Celisia Stanton, CELISIASTANTON, on Instagram, Twitter, all the things. And then you can also find True Crime at True Crime Pod on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok as well. And I'm mostly personally active on Instagram, but the True Crime account is really active on TikTok and on Instagram as well. And, you know, sometimes on Twitter.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Despite the technical issues, it has been so lovely to meet you and to talk to you. I think what you are doing within the true crime space is simply fantastic, and it's where the genre needs to be going. So thank you so much for being so candid with me about this.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed chatting with you and so excited to hear it.